With ASP.NET Core in .NET 6, we lost the Startup.cs file. All that functionality was moved into the Program.cs file. And while it was consolidated, the program file can get quite large, especially once you get into full production apps. In this video, we're going to be looking at the techniques to keep the Program.cs file clean and focused even as your application grows. We will use the minimal API since that's the product type that is the worst offender here. But these techniques will apply to all ASP.NET Core product types as well as to other projects in the C# ecosystem. Now, if you don't know me, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. I do that providing videos here on YouTube multiple times per week, plus I have a weekly podcast. I also provide courses on C#, web development, and much more at IamTimCorey.com. The profits from those sales are what pays for free content here on YouTube and other places like C#projects.com so that everyone can have a great education in C#, not just those who can afford it. In this video, as with most of my videos, I'm going to create some source code. If you want to copy that source code, use the link in the description. All right, let's look at our Visual Studio. We're going to create a new project, and we're going to choose the ASP.NET Core Web API project. And we're going to call this our API demo, and we'll call this API demo app. We'll hit next. We're going to choose .NET 6. That is the current framework as of the time of this video, the most recent. But even as .NET 7 comes out, this will still be the long-term supported version. So this will be supported until a year after .NET 8 comes out, just so you know. Authentication type we'll leave as none. We are going to configure for HTTPS, and we're not going to enable Docker because that's kind of outside the scope of this video. However, we are going to uncheck the use controllers because you want to use minimal APIs. The reason why is because this just adds even more pressure on our Program.cs file. So let's see how that works. We are going to leave the Open API support enabled. There's a couple reasons for that. First of all, that does add more pressure on Program.cs. Everything seems to, but also because I really encourage you to use the Open API, also known as Swagger. I encourage you to use that in your API projects. And finally, we are going to leave this unchecked for not using top-level statements. If you really don't like top-level statements, then you can check this box and get your namespace back and your class program and your static void main. Let's hit create. And we're going to go look at Program.cs. So this is the minimal API project. As you can see, if you haven't seen minimal APIs before, I have a whole video introducing these. But if you haven't seen before, they are very minimal because we only have one file. It's Program.cs. So we have the settings file, but that's basically it for our entire application. All the C# code lives here. So we right now have 43 lines of code. Now some of this is demo code. So for example, that's demo code. This is demo code. I might do a video on cleaning up every project type. Let me know down in the comments if that would be of interest to you, or go to suggestions.iamtimcorey.com and leave a suggestion there for that. If that sounds interesting to you, to do a project or a video where we clean up all the different project types so that they are ready for production use. It isn't too terribly hard, but you want to make sure you get all the different pieces out of every different project. So we'll handle this in a bit. We're going to put our own sample stuff in here, but I just want to point out, this is doing a lot of work. So we can ignore the code comments, but we've got some registration here of services. This is dependency injection. Now, in a sample project, we have 2 lines of dependency injection registrations. In a real project, you might have 50 or 100 or 200 lines of registrations for services. So depending on how big your project is, that could get quite massive. Then we have the configuration of Swagger. And this looks very, very simple. We have basically 2 lines. We have this wrapped in an if statement. But if you've worked with Swagger in any depth, and I go into really deep depth in my web API course, but when you do, you start to realize that this is the bare minimum for configuring Swagger. Instead, you want to do a lot of work in here to set things up and configure things and add things like versioning and allow it to use the your authentication, so you can have authenticated calls work with Swagger or OpenAPI, and so many other things you can do. Change a theme, all that you configure in here, and so this can get quite large as well. And then we have, for minimal APIs, the actual actions. That's just one action. And in fact, this code goes with it, and so is this code, but that's one action. Well, how many endpoints will your API have? Now, minimal APIs are designed to have only a few, but even at a few, we have quite a few lines of code for just one. Now, again, the way Microsoft does samples, it's not exactly best practices for half of it. Like, I wouldn't, this right here, it's doing the actual work instead of calling out to a class library to do the work and having a very simple call in here. So there's a little bit of, I wouldn't do it that way. But even so, you would have 4 or 5 lines per action or endpoint, and all of a sudden your endpoint list gets 30 lines or 40 lines in your program.cs. So if you have 30 or 40 lines here, you have, let's say, 50 lines here, then you have another 50 lines here. Now you're talking about 150, 200 lines of code in your program.cs file. And all of a sudden it's quite overwhelming. There's ways of doing this better. So this works great for demos in the start of your project. But for a real project in a real environment, let's see how we can make this work better for us. So I'm going to give you a flexible model of how to configure your application so that it can grow over time. And maybe at first you don't need this, but as you start to need it, you can start to implement it. And that's one key I want to point out is I wouldn't implement this right away. I wait until I start seeing the pressure. So we're already starting to see the pressure when we add in the endpoints here, but it could be okay to have a few endpoints in here and it's all in one spot and it's really easy to read. If it's 30, 40, 50 lines of code in program.cs, not a big deal. And the ease of having everything in one file kind of outweighs the downsides. But as you grow, let's talk about how to grow. And the first thing I would do is I would look at the services. If you have a real application, you probably have a growing list of services. Again, minimal API might be the exception if you have a very microservice-like approach to your minimal APIs, but anything that gets into production probably kind of expands and grows over time. This list will grow. Even if you have just logging and a couple other things, this list will start to grow. So let's create a new folder in our project. Add new folder. We're going to call this Startup. And naming is going to be important. I kind of like the idea of Startup since this kind of replaces Startup.cs, but not really. So this folder is all the startup stuff, which the startup stuff directly relates to Program.cs. So I would create a new class in here, and let's call this class Dependency Injection Setup. And we'll use our file scope namespace, and we're going to make this a static class. We're going to do a lot of extension method work today. If you're not familiar with extension methods, I have a whole video on this channel about extension methods. They can be very powerful, but they can also be abused. So be careful how you use them. I believe that video goes into more depth on when to and not to use them. This case is a good option for using our extension methods. So public static iService collection register services. I'm going to say this iService collection, and we'll call it services. And let's give you a look at what that actually looks like this. And at the end, I'm going to say return services. Now, how do I know to do this? Let's go back to our Program.cs. And right here, we're going to replace this section right here. And so I want to be able to have these two calls plus any additional calls in this extension method. So I'm going to look at this services here. Notice that it is an iService collection, and it returns an iService collection. So that's why I said this, that's the extension method identifier. You can see that whenever you see this in your parameter, that's telling you that this is an extension method. It's extending the iService collection. And we're going to return that as well so that we can chain these calls if we want to. Now let's take these two lines right here. And we're going to paste them in here, but they're not going to work because there is no builder. We don't have the web application builder, but we do have services. So we can say services dot add endpoint API Explorer and services dot add Swagger Gen, and then return that services. Now let's grab this namespace. We're going to copy it. And up at the very top, we're going to add that using for that namespace. And why? Well, because there is no namespace associated with the Program.cs file. So we have to bring in a namespace if we want to call an external file. In this case, we want to call the this extension method, which means we have to register this namespace in order to have access to it. But this is called register services. So we're going to get rid of all of this and say builder.services.register services. This replaced those two lines, which will grow into 20, 50, or 100 lines or more of registrations. So if you want to add dependency injection items now, you come over here and you could say services.add transient, and you can add your transient service, you can add scoped, you can add singletons, whatever you want to do for adding services. Now, this is really kind of the next level up when it comes to moving things out of Program.cs. It's kind of your first step. There may be a case where you'd have multiple different methods in here. Instead of just register services, maybe it says register standard services. And then you have register logging services if you have multiple. And you kind of group things as it makes sense. And then over here, you could have your line builder.services.register standard services dot register logging services dot register, and have all the registrations right there. But that way you can see what you're registering. You can separate them out into different methods so it's very clear and easy to identify what different things are, and it's not just one big blob even in here. So for right now, since we only have two, it makes sense to put them in one method. But as you grow, you can expand this out. But as you can see, we had something already in place here that we swapped out and improved with this one line moving these things over here. Now, you might say, well, Tim, you have one line that replaces the two lines, but really it's actually all these lines, 12 lines, which means it's kind of, it feels inefficient. Well, yes, it does for just these two entries. But like I said, if you had 20, that's when it becomes more obviously beneficial to move them out. So again, that's why I say grow up with this, start with a standard, and then move things out as necessary. Let's take on the Swagger. And I'm not going to configure Swagger to do lots of extra stuff, but let's pretend like we needed to configure Swagger to do something for us that was taking up more lines of code. Well, what we can do is we can come back to the Solution Explorer, right-click on Startup, and say Add New Class. And we're going to say Swagger Configuration. We'll add our semicolon here. And we're going to say this is a static class. It's important to put static. And then we're going to say public static web application configure Swagger. This web application app. Now, how do I know web application? Back over here, we're dealing directly with the app. What is app? It's a nullable web application. However, if you mouse over it, you can see this note right here, app is not null here because we just did a build. We assign a value to it. Therefore, we're not going to use the nullable version of web application. We're going to use the non-nullable version because we know that's not going to be null. So we can just take this right here. We can copy it. We can paste it in here. And at the bottom, return app. And again, we're returning the same thing that we extend. That way we can continue to chain these commands together if we so choose. So now we can, instead of doing this, we can say app.configure Swagger. And it's pretty clear what's going on. Let's get rid of that. It's pretty clear what's going on. We're configuring Swagger. And in fact, if you wanted to continue on and kind of chain these, we could say .use HTTPS redirection. Like so, instead of having this line, you can kind of chain them together. But we're going to keep them as separate lines because Microsoft did. Now, that takes care of the configuring of Swagger. And again, we named it well so that we know exactly what's happening. Register services, we know exactly what's happening. Configure Swagger, we know exactly what's happening. Now down here, we have app.mapGet. We can ignore this for a minute. That's our sample code. So what is app.mapGet? Well, it's an endpoint. So let's right-click on Startup and say class map endpoints. And again, semicolon, again, static. And then in here, we'll say public static web application map user endpoints. This web application app. And again, we know it's a web application because it's right off the app. And again, we're returning web application. So we're going to say return app so we can chain these together. Now I said slightly more specific than just map endpoints. And I actually spelled it wrong. Map endpoints, there we go. I said map user endpoints because here's where I'd get a little bit more specific right off the bat. Normally when you have controllers in an API, you have a controller per name. So you have the user's controller, you have the person controller, you have, I'm not sure, address controller, whatever different controllers you have, and they reference one kind of group of different actions. Well, with the endpoints, we don't necessarily have that, but let's say we want to get to that point. We could just say map endpoints, but I would think we'd probably have a couple different groupings of endpoints, so we actually had do different groupings. Now, instead of using Microsoft's quite not great example, we're going to build our own quite not great example. So app.mapGet /user. And we'll just say, hello, user. And that's an endpoint. So if you call the /user, then you get back a message that just says, hello, user. And we'll map one more just for fun. App.mapGet. And this is a question that people often ask me. How do you pass in a variable? Well, let's pass in a variable of a name. We're going to say string name. And our arrow. And we'll say hello name. All right. And now that's two different endpoints, one for just user and one for a specific user. And this one says hello user. This one says hello Tim or whatever name you pass in. And that's it for mapping our endpoints. So now you can come back over here to Program.cs, and instead of app.mapGet, we called it app.mapUserEndpoints. So app.mapUserEndpoints, like so. Now imagine if we had multiple endpoints. Let's actually create something like that, where this is just the endpoints file. And again, you should not have lots of code in your endpoint itself. So this should probably call a method in a class library. So just pass right through to the class library. But so this can be small. We can have another method here. Public static web application map. And let's call this something different. Map dog endpoints. This web application app, and we'll say app.map get /dog, and we'll say, let's do our arrow. Good boy. Like so, and return app. So now we have user endpoints and we have dog endpoints or dog endpoint. So with that, we could come back over here and we could say map user endpoints. We could also say app.map dog endpoints, like so. Or what we could do is we could do this and just do it. So app.map user endpoints, app.map dog endpoints, and kind of chain them together. That way we can kind of see what different groupings of endpoints we have. Now, let's leave this like this. We'll get rid of Microsoft sample code. We don't need that. We'll get rid of all the sample code. And now we have a Program.cs that could be production ready. I mean, we could have more services registered. We could have more endpoints inside these mappings. And we could have configured Swagger more fully. And yet this Program.cs file wouldn't have changed sizes. At most, if we had more endpoints with different groupings, we might have a couple more lines here with the different groupings. But with that, we have a working API that has a really simple and easy to read Program.cs that tells you exactly what's going on. And when you say, well, yeah, but how do you register services? Everything is under the startup.c or startup folder, not startup.cs, startup folder, and it's labeled dependency injection, mapping endpoints, Swagger configuration, so that it's very easy to see where everything is and how everything works. So that way, when you go to read your application, yes, it's in 4 different files now instead of 1 file, but it allows us to have a cleaner separation so that when we say, hey, Swagger's not configured right, we don't have to look through dependency injection code to find the Swagger code. Instead, we go right to Swagger configuration and figure out, oh, we're only showing it in development. We should probably take that off and show it even in production. So we would know where to go because of the fact that it's not kind of buried in the midst of services and endpoints and all the rest. So as you scale out your application, as your API gets bigger, or your MVC project, or Razor Pages, or Blazor Server, or Blazor WebAssembly, whatever those projects are you're building, as they scale out, you can scale out this system. As you saw with map endpoints, we could add other methods in these classes. Or you might say, it's just too big. We have too much stuff in map user endpoints. So let's create a map user endpoints.cs file that just has mapping user endpoints. And we'll have a different one for dog endpoints and a different one for, I don't know, cat endpoints. So you can scale this out and grow this as you need, as it makes sense, but you don't have to go crazy day one. You don't have to configure everything and have this complex system when maybe you only have 30 or 40 lines of code to begin with. In that case, probably you leave everything in Program.cs. But as you grow, you can start to grow with it and create this structure that makes sense that you can grow with over time. Now, just to show that, yes, this does work, let's go ahead and launch this and make sure that it doesn't break. Let's pull this up. There we go. So we have our 3 endpoints /user/user/name and dog. So let's say user, and we're going to try this out and execute. Actually, you know what? Let's do this by actually calling it. It's probably easier for me to zoom in. So /user, let's zoom in here. There's /user. Now let's say it's users /user/Tim. Hello, Tim, that works. And then let's go to /dog. Good boy. So we've got our API working. It's showing up in Swagger. We've got all the configuration set up. We can tweak it even more. But with that, we have everything we need for a full working API. But our Program.cs is clean, neat, and easy to read and understand. This is what Microsoft was doing with things like this. Use HTTPS redirection. That's not just one line of code. There's a whole lot of code behind that and how it works. Create builder. Oh my goodness, is there code behind this? There's a ton of code behind this that does a lot of stuff. So is build. So these things right here are already kind of making things easier to understand and putting things behind one name so that you don't have a whole lot of code just kind of sit in Program.cs. You can boil it down to one method call. We're doing the same thing here. We're emulating what Microsoft is doing and saying, yeah, we can do that too. Let's do that. That way we can be a little bit clearer in our Program.cs. It can read like a book. Remember, code is meant to be read by humans. So when you read this through, I think it makes sense. We create the builder, that's Microsoft's line. We register our services, that's our line. We build, that's Microsoft's line. We configure Swagger, that's our line. HTTPS redirection, that's Microsoft's line. Mapping our endpoints, that's our line. And then Microsoft's run. So it's pretty clear what's happening in each line. Now, each line does kind of, I wouldn't say hide, but it does summarize what's going on behind the scenes. If you want more information, you just go to that entry. And of course, we can also use F12. So if I didn't know where this was, even though I clearly put it into the startup folder, I can just hit F12 and go right to it and see exactly what configure Swagger means. So that's my recommendation for how to clean up the Program.cs file. Again, I used API or minimal API because it's the worst offender. But even if you are using other product types that might not be as bad, you can still use this for services or like dependency injection and Swagger configuration, potentially if you also implement API or just dependency injection. But even if you go to other product types where you don't have this, start to think through, hey, can I kind of put things behind a descriptor? Can I put things behind a configure Swagger? Or something, a name like that makes sense and it can easily be read and understood what's happening, and it hides a lot of the implementation details until you need to see them. All right, so that's my suggestion for making things cleaner, easier to read, and easier to understand, especially in ASP.NET Core web projects. Thanks for watching, and as always, I am Tim Corey.